gonna start the broadcast in just a minute, and they'll be able to hear us. So keep yourselves on mute, and then Matt, get started whenever you feel ready.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Matt Piotrowski, Senior Director of Policy and Research at Climate Advisors. Welcome to today's Orbitas event. We're very excited for our discussion, and we really appreciate your time. Our presentation today will be on our recent report that focuses on financial risks of deforestation emissions tied to commodities imported to the United States. Orbitas is an initiative of climate advisors and focuses on emerging climate transition risks and highlights opportunities for investors. We developed this report in partnership with AidEnvironment and Profundo, and we are very excited that they are part of today's event. This report and our discussion today come at a time when there is increasing focus on Scope 3 emissions, which are emissions that occur within a company's supply chain or through the use of its goods and services. Just recently, California passed a law requiring large companies operating in a state to disclose their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is currently finalizing its disclosure rule and may include Scope 3 requirements. In our Orbitas analysis, by showing the high levels of value at risk, we highlight the importance of investors working with producers and traders of agricultural commodities that are critical to U.S. and global food systems to identify their Scope 3 supply chain emissions. Maintaining a business-as-usual approach to imported forest risk commodities may leave investors in the dark regarding future financial risks, potentially exposing their broader portfolios to harsh impacts from climate change. We will be discussing these issues and many others today. Today's presenters will be Emma McMahon of Climate Advisors, Sarah Dross of AidEnvironment, and Gerard Reich of Profundo. A few housekeeping issues before we move forward. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but if you have any questions, you can type your questions into the Q&A, and we will aim to answer them after our presentation. And we can also make slides available upon request after the event. Now I'll hand it over to Emma.
Hello, everyone. We're so glad you could join us for our webinar. And I'll get started by setting the scene with a bit of context. So to start, why are forests so important, and why does deforestation matter? Forests are the lungs of the world. They are one of the largest carbon sinks in the world and stop CO2 emissions from reaching the atmosphere. In total, forests are estimated to absorb 7.6 billion metric tons of carbon each year, roughly 1.5 times the carbon emitted by the US. Deforestation shrinks the world's carbon sinks and releases carbon into the atmosphere. The impact of this is significant. Even if all other emissions stopped, left unchecked, deforestation puts the world on a path of more than 2 degrees of warming by 2100. This is a real risk, and one of the largest contributors to deforestation is agriculture, as you'll see in my next slide. So here are some key facts about forest, food, and land. 23% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the forest, food, and land sector. 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation. 39% of deforestation is predicted to result from international trade. And up to 30% of the mitigation needed to keep warming under 2 degrees Celsius is based on ending deforestation by 2030. Moving beyond these statistics, though, most deforestation in the developing world is linked to internationally traded commodities, and it is illegal deforestation. Complex supply chains obscure the impacts of deforestation on marginal groups. They also obscure labor violations and illegal activity, leaving investors unable to reliably assess exposure or alignment to personal and institutional values. The big driver, or one of the biggest threats to forests, are what we call forest risk commodities. Next slide, please. Agricultural expansion for forest risk commodities like beef, soy, and palm oil are one of the primary drivers of forest loss. They cause 83% of non-wildfire forest loss in the US, and they result in biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, and pose significant sustainability and climate change related challenges. But a large section of these emissions are excluded from most conversations about emissions because of how they are categorized. Next slide, please. So here's an explanation of how emissions are categorized into scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions such that result from an organization's activities. An example would be emissions from a fleet vehicle. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from purchased utilities such as electricity. And scope 3 emissions include all other emissions along a value chain. And if that sounds a bit vague, it's because it is. There are 15 different categories of scope 3 emissions. And for many companies, scope 3 could be more than 80% of total emissions. Next slide, please. Regulation in this area is changing quickly. In March of last year, the SEC released a draft of a proposed rule, which would require domestic and foreign registrants to include extensive climate change-related disclosures in their registration statements and periodic reports. It would require all of them, regardless of size, to disclose their scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, and require them to disclose scope 3 if it was deemed to be material or if a company had targets or goals related to those types of emissions. Analysis of the comments to the SEC on this proposed rule showed that 69% of the comments from asset managers and investment companies support disclosure of all scopes of greenhouse gas emissions as a fundamental requirement of this rule. Very recently, California passed SB 253, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, which was recently signed into law. This law will require that all companies operating in California with revenues greater than $1 billion disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions starting in 2026 and scope 3 in 2027. This remit is broader than the proposed SEC rule. It impacts an estimated 5,300 companies and requires companies not only to disclose those emissions, but also to obtain third-party assurance of those disclosures and to do broader climate-related financial risk analysis in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. International rules are also changing. The EU, UK, and the ISSB, which is a part of the International Financial Reporting Standards, a body which sets accounting standards, have all taken steps to require Scope 3 disclosure and are trying to build understanding of the importance of these disclosures and greater sophistication in the analysis of these disclosures. Next slide. So bringing it back to forest, food, and land, we can see that Scope 3 emissions are a vital part of the picture to understand the impact of this sector. If we only considered Scope 1 and 2 emissions of downstream food companies, we would not get the full picture. The food sector supply chain has the highest emissions of any sector in the world, up to 25% of global emissions, and 83% of food sector emissions are considered Scope 3. 90% of fast-moving consumer goods are Scope 3. Bringing this into the real world, when looking at Nestle's disclosures, we can see that 95% of their emissions are categorized as Scope 3. And looking at Mars, 29% of their value chain emissions are generated from tropical commodity-driven deforestation. Next slide, please. And the impacts go far beyond just the food sector. In total, US companies imported $618 billion in tropical commodities in 2020, of which $76 billion were from agricultural commodities. And many sectors within the economy are directly exposed to these tropical commodities. Next, please. So it was in the light of this context that we partnered with AidEnvironment and Profundo to carry out analysis and write a report quantifying the risks of imported Scope 3 emissions from deforestation to the US. We covered 6 commodities: beef, coffee, soy, rubber, palm oil, and cocoa, carried out financial analysis based on 3 carbon pricing scenarios, and quantified the imported emissions from deforestation to the US. Next, here are a couple of our top line results. So as you can see, emission intensity from deforestation varies between imported raw materials, but a couple of commodities stood out as being especially emissions intensive. Specifically, cattle and coffee, as illustrated in this graph, you can see, have an outsized impact on deforestation emissions. Next. Here are a few of our top-line key findings. Imported Scope 3 emissions are significant. In 2019, Scope 3 emissions from deforestation to produce commodities imported to the US totaled 21.24 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. This rivals the total 2020 annual emissions of countries like Croatia and Honduras, and outpaces countries like Congo, Nicaragua, and Panama. The total value at risk is also high. From the value chains we looked at, the value at risk ranges from $7.28 to $114.98 billion. Similarly, gross profits for these commodities could decline significantly. Next. Reputational risks are also material. The reputational risks compound existing civil society climate transition risk and put $2.4 to $24.81 billion at risk. Risk is also concentrated for each commodity. It's concentrated within a few companies and a few countries. And US financial institutions have skin in the game to the tune of close to $24 billion. I'll end with just a couple of our recommendations. First, all companies that can should consider sourcing from countries with lower deforestation risk. Second, all companies, even those without that flexibility, should consider increasing supply chain monitoring to avoid links to deforestation. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sarah.
Thank you, Emma. So hi, I'm Sarah. I'm working for AidEnvironment, and I'm going to, in this part of the presentation, explain to you how we have calculated the carbon emissions for each of the commodity sectors linked to US consumption. Next slide, please. So I'm working for AidEnvironment. It's a sustainability consultancy based in the Netherlands. We also have an office in Indonesia and Uganda. And I work for the Deforestation-Free Supply Chains team. And with this team, we generally involve in supply chain mapping. We do global trade data analysis, but also real-time deforestation monitoring and zero deforestation benchmarking of companies. Next slide, please. So for my part of the research, for AidEnvironment's part, we have 4 research questions that we have addressed. So in each of the next slides, I'm going to explain these questions. So first, we have looked at the volumes of the most important deforestation risk commodities in the US. Then we have tied these commodities to the geographies where the US is most tied to deforestation risk through its trade. Then we have looked at the key US importers per commodity group. And then finally, we arrived at this estimation of deforestation-linked carbon emissions linked to US consumption. So we initially included more commodities that are listed in the final report. So we started with soy, beef, leather, palm oil, wood, cocoa, coffee, and rubber. But for some of these commodities, such as wood, there was no emissions data available. So they were not in the final report. Next question, next slide, please. So here I'm going to explain first how we calculated the volumes of the most important deforestation risk commodities. So we relied here mainly on US trade statistics. And in the table on top, you can see that particularly wood and rubber are some of the most imported products in the US. And we have compared it also with EU trade statistics. And this is very useful because it also gives you indications where deforestation risk can be tied to commodity imports. Because, for instance, we found that beef, especially frozen beef and prepared beef, are mainly imported in the US more than in the EU. And also this is mainly originating from Brazil. So there's more deforestation risk linked to beef, linked to the US. But then on the other hand, for soy, this is the other way around. You can see that the imports of soy in the EU are much, much higher compared to the US. So then their soy-related deforestation risk is likely much smaller for the US. So the bottom table shows you that for cocoa as a category, we included a lot of derivatives. So it's not only looking at cocoa beans, but we also looked at chocolate, cocoa paste, butter, powder, etc. And then in the bottom table, the green highlighted products are the top 3 most imported products in the US. Next slide, please. So here you can see, well, we here estimated or not estimated. Here we checked the countries that supply the most imported products in the US. So as I said, for cocoa, these were chocolate, cocoa beans, and cocoa paste. So for each of them, we listed the top 10 supplier countries. So for cocoa beans, these are Cote d'Ivoire and Ecuador mainly. And then in orange highlighted, we categorized each of the countries, whether they have deforestation risk or not. And we based this on several studies, for instance, on the FAO State of Forest study that gives an indication whether there is still intact forest left or whether there has been net forest loss. Also, we checked with FAO-stat data if there was commodity production that was relevant, because imagine, for instance, here that in Tanzania there is no cocoa bean production, then obviously it would not be relevant to include. So one major limitation of this study is that we only were able to include direct deforestation-linked carbon emissions and not indirect or so-called embedded deforestation risk. So as an example here, so we saw that actually chocolate, as can be in bar forms, is the most imported product in the US. But that chocolate is being imported, for instance, from Europe or from Canada. But obviously it's not directly tied to a deforestation risk country. But the raw cocoa beans that are being used to prepare this chocolate, they are being imported in the EU from, for instance, Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana. So there's also embedded deforestation risk in such product. But so far as we could have identified, there is no methodology to calculate this embedded deforestation risk. Next slide, please. So then, based on the geographies where the commodities originate from, we were able to identify high-risk combinations of countries and commodities. So then for beef, obviously Brazil was a high deforestation risk country that is mainly tied to US consumption. And for coffee beans, Colombia was a high risk combination for coffee. And for rubber products, this was, for instance, Indonesia. So for each of those high risk combinations, we have analyzed shipment data to identify the top 15 largest importers of those products. So here you see an example of beef originating from Brazil and who are the top 15 importers. Next slide, please. So then for the last research questions that AidEnvironment has addressed, we have calculated the carbon emissions per commodity sector linked to US consumption. So this is the final result, and I'm going to explain in the next slide how we arrived at these calculations. But you can see that already, as Emma also showed, that for beef, for instance, and coffee and rubber, this is in megatons carbon dioxide equivalent. But for those commodities, the carbon emissions are quite high. So this is one very important source that we have used for this is a Pendrel database. So Pendrel data is basically giving estimates of carbon emissions for a huge list of commodities linked to all the countries in the world. And the database covers 2001 till 2018. So we were only we could only rely on the last year of data that was available, which was 2018. So next slide, please. So here in the table, you can see that we, as a step one, we first only looked at the countries with deforestation risk that appeared in our import data in the US. So for those countries, we have looked up the emissions data of Pendrel. And as I said, we could only take the last year available, which is 2018. So we did not include here countries that did not show any deforestation emissions. So for instance, for beef, we know that the US also imports beef from mainly Canada and New Zealand, but they were not included here because they don't show any deforestation emissions. So first, we assumed a correlation between production quantities and deforestation emissions. So that's why we also looked up production quantities in the same year as the emissions. And that was based on FAO-stat data, the third column. So then in the left part of the equation below, you can see that we calculated the proportion of emissions per production quantity in the year 2018. And then basically we extrapolated this ratio to 2022, where we have the import data. And we also made a huge assumption there, because we have assumed that the production of commodity in the year 2018 would produce an equal amount of carbon emissions in 2022. So then we have the whole equation as a total, and then we arrived at these deforestation emissions in megatons carbon dioxide equivalents linked to US imports in 2022 for each of those countries. So you can see that Colombia scores highest here. And then we have summed up all these quantities, and that's how we arrived at the number of 5.7. So this was my part of the presentation. I give the floor now also to Gerard from Profundo, who is going to deep dive in the financial implications.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. Well, this part of the presentation is about the financial risks of the Scope 3 emissions from imported forest risk commodities into the United States. And the question is, are they material and can they affect the US financial system? My role in Profundo is to calculate a value for financial risk, and in this way, that's important. Finances and NGOs have a better discussion on the materiality of these risks, and that's also what we plan to do in the next slides. Next slide, please. Yeah, there are three key questions. How can the transition through the high chance regulation or civil society pressure on imported forest risk commodities lead to financial risk? And there are various risk categories. As you can see, it's about stranded assets, revenue risk, financing risk, reputation risk, and these risks are very closely linked to each other, and they can escalate. A change in demand can lead to declining revenues and stranded assets as well. Declining revenues lead to lower operating profits. Lower profits could lead to financial ratios deteriorate, and companies might need to pay higher interest rates for loans. These higher interest rates might also be due to reputation issues connected to doing activities in imported forest risk commodities. And reputation risk overall is a broader theme. People might not want to work anymore in certain industries, and a brain drain can occur, etc. Second question, how crucial are the imported forest risk commodities in specific processing industries? For instance, how is the car industry dependent on natural rubber? And the third important question is, and when the value of evaluation risk have been calculated, how material is the potential risk versus the asset base of financial institutions US-wide? Next slide. As a first step, we investigate the importance of the, by Sarah, calculated Scope 3 emissions for the US economy. As can be seen in this table, the 21 million ton CO2 equivalent from these imported forest risk commodities is 0.35% of the total emissions in the United States. And in this group, imported forest risk beef is the largest sector with 53% of the total. Also, coffee is large, 27%. And as Sarah explained, wood has not been considered. On the next slide, we see the next step, and the next step is to calculate the costs of emissions. Carbon pricing is seen as a proxy for climate damage costs. However, the theory is still in development, and the right pricing is discussed in many articles. Therefore, we apply three scenarios here. Scenario 1 is based on the average carbon pricing in several US jurisdictions, and that is the 34.1 US dollar in the first column. The second scenario is based on the current European Union carbon price in the European Union emission trading system, and that's currently around 96.3 US dollars when we recalculate it from euros to US dollars. Scenario 3 has by far the highest carbon dioxide cost per ton, and this is based on the so-called societal cost of carbon dioxide, and is itself an average of 3 studies on this topic. And well, this average, we have 1,160 per ton CO2, but the highest calculation is around 3,000. And this 3,000 per ton, that includes a scenario in which GDP in 2100, so 80 years from now, will be hit by 37% of all the environmental impacts of CO2 emissions. When we apply the emissions of 21 million tons with the 3 prices, we see the CO2 cost of between 723 million and US dollar and 25 billion USD dollar. And as percentage of GDP, this is, well, it's nearly 0% of GDP. And the high range is 0.1% of GDP. Of course, in the context of the US economy, this is a low number. In the next slides, next slide, please. In the next slides, the value chain of imported forest risk commodities is analyzed. This first slide shows that the risk is relatively concentrated in a limited number of trading and importing companies. Cacao comes from 93% from forest risk countries, and the top 15 US importers from Côte d'Ivoire, which is a high-risk forest risk country, make up 87% of these imports. In coffee, the concentration, as you can see, is much lower. Next slide. And what is the value of these imported forest risk commodities? Here we used end of 2022 prices and came to a total of 5.8 billion US dollar. The various top 15 companies in the various sectors have nearly half of this. Take that into account. So it's really concentrated. In value, palm oil is the largest. This 5.8 billion US dollar is the value at the border of the United States. But these embedded forest risk commodities are processed in the USA, and the value is added by every step in the supply chain. So this 5.8 billion is not indicative for the total value within the United States economy. That's what we can see in the next slide. In the various chain levels, every company is adding value to the embedded material and is earning a profit. For several commodities, Chain Reaction Research and Profundo have calculated these pricing up ratios. For instance, in palm, the 100, which is an index that is earned by a smallholder, by a farmer, is priced up to 115 by the trader. And the downstream actors, like fast-moving consumer good companies, like retailers, they are adding it up to 160. That's for the fast-moving consumer good company, and to 194. That is to the retailer. In soy meal, which is embedded in, for instance, meat and in dairy, the pricing up is much stronger and even goes to 302 index-wise. These existing models are applied as a proxy for the various imported forest risk commodities, which are investigated here. The supply chain of cacao is a mix of sugarcane, soy meal, and palm, as we use averages from these. Next slide. Yes, when applying these pricing up ratios, the 5.8 billion imported value for risk commodities, I already said that is a low number, moves up to 13.3 billion US dollar in the total supply chain. This is an important number that to be used further in later calculations. Next slide. How important are these imported forest risk commodities in the various value chains? Well, Brazilian beef and soy are 2% or less of US consumption. So that's, let's say, a relatively low number. A ban would not really affect the market material, probably. Rubber, palm, and coffee from imported forest risk commodities are relatively important and might affect downstream sectors here and there considerably. Apparel is using a lot of rubber, and automotive in rubber, and Starbucks in coffee. Next slide. Well, now it's time to move to the financial risks. How large are the climate damage costs that we calculated versus the chain values? If we calculate with scenario 1, which is this table, what you see is an example for scenario 1, and that is the lowest carbon price. The cost in total are 718 million, as we already have seen, and this 718 million, that is 5% of the chain value. Beef faces relatively the highest costs, 21% in climate damage cost. The report which is released by Orbitas shows that in scenario 2 and 3, these percentages are much higher versus the 5% in this low scenario. Scenario 2 with the higher carbon costs calculates 15%. And for scenario 3, it's even, the carbon damage costs are even 184% of the value of the total chain of these for imported forest risk commodities. Note that these costs are versus the embedded tons, so not the full price, not the full product, like a bottle of shampoo is affected in this way, in case we talk about, for instance, palm oil. Next slide, please. As there are no price elasticity models available, we assume that the 3 climate damage cost scenarios are an indication to the hit to the chain value in case of regulation or civil society pressure. Then in scenario 1, 5% of the market will disappear, or 718 million euros. In scenario 2, we assume 15% of the market will disappear. And in scenario 3, we assume that 100% of the market will disappear. Well, for the US market, this means that the part of the value added will be lost. As the gross margin in the chain is 56%, we calculate that the loss of the gross margin in each market decline scenario. That leads to a range of 404 to 700.5 billion US dollars. As these are annual numbers, we need to make a discounted cash flow from this to calculate a value number that can be compared to invested capital. This number is 11.1 times higher at between 4.5 billion and 83 billion. On top of this, the companies will face financing risk, but there was no opportunity in the context of this report to calculate this. Next slide, please. Well, reputation risk is a risk that gets not enough attention in the financial world. The earlier mentioned industries that are relatively dependent on some sectors, on some imported forest risk commodities, might face huge reputation risk, others much smaller. As all numbers are based on embedded volumes, adjustments have been automatically made, and we do not see the full scale on the shampoo producer, for instance. Earlier studies have indicated reputation value loss of percentage loss of between 3 and 30%, following consistent lack of proactive action on unsustainable behavior by companies. These percentages are used in the low and high scenario setting and lead to 2.4 billion to 25 billion reputation value at risk. The calculations are based on market value, implicit market value of the US asset, based on the added value per year, and these again put into a discounted cash flow model. Next slide. That's the summary. The summary slide for all risks. Here we add the various value numbers and come to a total value at risk of between 7 billion and 115 billion. Note that various negative elements have not been considered yet due to the several complexities which need more work. I mentioned the financing risk, furthermore, the impact of imported forest risk commodities on the total price level in the market and therefore affecting local production of commodities. And finally, the negative impact on government finances. Imported forest risk commodities do reduce the US domestic industry activity and employment, and also the price level and the domestic profitability. This really affects various US tax proceeds. So versus total US financial assets, these forest risk loss are nearly 0% to 0.15%. The relative size might not affect the US economy too much. Well, next slide and my last slide. Finally, how are the US financial institutions involved in financing of these imported forest risk activities? Well, the financial flows to forest risk sectors in the forest risk countries, so in the upstream, was $24 billion in the 2018-2023 period. 64% of this was to Latin America. And the various top 15 companies that were financed by US institutions for $5 billion. However, take into account these numbers do not include financing of the downstream sector. The companies that use the imported forest risk commodities. This needs additional complex work, including adjusters for embedded volumes, etc. The outcomes will further escalate the previous given number in scenario 3, the value at risk of between 7 to 115 billion. And with this, I hand over to Matt.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Gerard. And thanks to all the panelists for your great presentations. Now we will go to the Q&A. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll hope to get to them. We have a few more minutes left. So the first question I have is for Emma. Could you talk about the importance of the California disclosure rule on scope 3 that recently just passed and signed by Governor Newsom?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. The California law is really interesting because it is the first law in the US which requires that companies disclose their scope 3 emissions. So as I said in my presentation, it requires that all companies with revenues greater than $1 billion disclose scopes 1 and 2 starting in 2026 and scope 3 starting in 2027. And California historically has been a leader on climate change. They have led in areas like car fleet, fuel efficiency, and in other areas, and are really like the leading edge of climate policy in the US. Their law reaches further than the proposed draft released by the SEC, and could impact companies that aren't necessarily based in California but just operate there. And yeah, I think it's a really big move and potentially a bellwether for where the world is moving more broadly on scope 3 disclosure.
Great, thank you so much for that, Emma. This conversation has been focused mainly on the US, but there's been conversations in other jurisdictions on scope 3 disclosure. Gerard and Sarah, could you give maybe like a brief overview about the status of scope 3 disclosures in Europe?
Yeah, I can say something about, so we have in Europe the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. So under that reporting directive, companies will need to disclose on scope 3 emissions. So the directive was adopted in 2022, and it will be implementing from next year, from 2024. So I think it goes, yeah, already a bit further than the US scope 3 disclosure, except from California. And then there's, I think, also specific for financial institutes. Well, Gerard, you probably are better suited to address that, but I don't think there's like disclosure rules already for financial institutions, right?
No, not yet, but also the financial institutions, they belong to large listed companies, and there is a large phasing period from 2024 to 2029, with starting with large companies and then ending with smaller companies. And the first round of that it's necessary to really publish, it's around 25-26 in the European Union. And the all the publications on scope 3 by the different producing companies, they are necessary, of course, for financial institutions to fill in their scope 3 emissions. So they need the scope 3 emissions from producing companies, which they finance, to calculate their own scope 3 emissions. Yes, in the end, gradually, and also through increasing pressure in the European Parliament, all sectors will be included, including the financial sector.
Great, thanks for that overview. Now back to the U.S. So in the previous Congress, there was a bill that was introduced called the U.S. Forest Act that looked at the issues of disclosure and reducing U.S. imports of commodities tied to illegal deforestation. Emma, could you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So as you said, the Forest Act, which is, of course, an acronym, as many of the proposed laws in the US are, it's the Fostering Overseas Rule of Law and Environmentally Sound Trade Act. It was last introduced in 2021. It has not yet been introduced in this Congress, but that could happen. And it really aims, it really focuses on illegal deforestation, which, is, I think, estimated to be roughly half of tropical forest deforestation. And it empowers the Customs and Border Patrol Agency to increase enforcement, and it would prohibit market access for commodities which are produced on illegally deforested land. I think in terms of placing this in context, it is not as far reaching as, say, the EUDR, but it is a really good first step in terms of requiring more disclosure, transparency, and establishing a risk-based framework for transparency for sourcing. And it would also impact, I think, government sourcing rules and preferences, which has knock-on effects throughout the economy.
Great, thank you so much for that, Emma. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the data that was used in the research for the report. So what data limitations did you come across while doing the research for this report?
I can answer that. Yeah, so as I already indicated a few data limitations in the presentation. So one data limitation was that we have looked at all those supplier countries, and as I said, we did try to estimate whether the country was high deforestation risk. But at the same time, we could not do a systematic study of all the supplying countries that are available because, as I said, we looked at all those derivatives of products, and in total, we had analyzed around 100 derivatives that each of them has like top 10 supplier countries. So in total, we would then need to assess like well, hundreds of countries on the deforestation drivers. So that was not done in the study. Then also, as I indicated in my part of the presentation, we had to make a lot of assumptions to calculate the carbon emissions. So as I said, we assumed, for instance, that the production of a commodity in 2018 would give the same amount of emissions in 2022, which does not need to be necessarily true. Imagine that they have changed the way of producing. Maybe they have produced more sustainable. So yeah, this is a huge assumption. Then we have also looked into shipment data, which is also a limitation because shipment data is always a sample. It's not like complete. It doesn't give you all the volumes that are available, because some companies also ship commodities under logistical companies instead of under their own name. So yeah, that's just some limitations that we have encountered linked to the data.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. We have time for a few more questions. So I have a couple here. What are some effective strategies for companies to reduce their Scope 3 footprint, and what role can investors and banks play in helping reduce Scope 3 emissions?
Question for me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think.
For you, Gerard, yep.
Yes. Well, there are two ways that investors can have an impact. That is by divestment or by engagement. And well, we know already since many years the big impact of deforestation. So that's where investors, owners of companies, shareholders of companies, could start to engage with companies to get deforestation, illegal and legal, out of the supply chain.
Great, thanks. And one follow-up, you talked about reputation risk. Could you give some example of how Scope 3 can impact a company's brand and reputation?
Yeah, that's a good question. When of course, when a company like Procter & Gamble consistently continues to buy palm oil without a good monitoring where the palm oil comes from, and the consumer is buying a product which is linked to deforestation, the consumer might take a stance that they don't like the shampoo anymore. And that's, of course, having an impact on, it might have an impact on the volumes, on the revenues. And that is a market access risk. But also the fact that this is consistently happening in a company, by a company, might lead to the fact that that also retailers say, well, we don't like this product anymore on eye level of the shelf. We put it below, or even we don't take it anymore on our shelf. It might affect the fact that people don't want to work anymore at the company, like what happened in the fossil fuel industry, that people don't like to work there anymore. And of course, last but not least, it might affect the value of a company. So there is the value of a company, the market, the equity value of a company also comprises a piece of reputation value. It's very difficult to calculate it, but there is a company with a good reputation has a higher valuation than a company with a low valuation. There has been research on this. When the reputation of a company which is completely focused on one item, and in that item they are doing very consistently bad things, not proactive, then the share price might decline by 20% or 30%. However, when companies do it consistently right, the share price might increase by 20%. And then the difference between the two companies, the bad guy and the good guy, from the index of from 100 to 70 or from 100 to 120, the difference between 70 and 120, that is 70% in share price performance. That is reputation, and that is affecting the value of an investment portfolio.
Great, thanks for that, Gerard. And we imagine the reputation risk will only grow as there are stronger policies in this area.
Yes, that's right. Stronger policies, and of course the problem is also let's say the social media are accelerating this process because news is flowing. The news flow is accelerating, and that's why also the reputation impact might be much larger. The reputation impact has already increased substantially between 2000 and 2018 already because of social media.
Great, thanks for that. So we have about time for one more question. Sarah, this one for you, and if Emma or Gerard want to chime in too. What does a strong no deforestation commitment look like for a company? What effective strategies can they implement to have a robust no deforestation commitment?
Yeah, I think, well, especially started in the palm oil industry is the NDPE, the so-called NDPE, which is the no deforestation, no peat and no exploitation. So this basically already covers that, yeah, you should have no deforestation, no degradation, but also no exploitation of local communities. And this is often covered by the so-called FPIC, so the free, prior and informed consent of local communities if you want to expand your plantations, for instance. Also under NDPE policies is often included that you do not burn areas. So I think, yeah, if you look up NDPE commitments, I think it covers, yeah, it's basically a very strong deforestation commitment.
And on top of these commitments, there should also be the execution in monitoring and verification. And that might give some extra costs, but the benefits are really enormous. Again, we come back to that question about reputation. The benefits in reputation are enormous.
Great, thank you for that. And I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you to the panelists for this timely and important discussion. And we thanks everybody for joining our conversation today. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And we really appreciate everybody's time and hope to see you all at a future event. Thank you.